So,
I think we're back. Thank you. I'm really personally very excited about this last session. It's entitled the Ctti model, Canadian Cancer Clinical Trial Stakeholder Charter. For those of you who've participated in the past 3 Colorectal Cancer Canada conferences, this charter was born 2 conferences ago with the inspiration that was provided from the first conference. So what's fantastic about the work that CC does and the sponsorship of this kind of conference is that working groups of stakeholder volunteers are put together based on the needs that are identified as part of the conversation that happens in these conferences, and an ecosystem is formed and communicated with after that. So the charter document itself was sent around as part of the registration confirmation. It's also in the resource section, which I pointed out, and it's also on the Colorectal Cancer Canada's microsite. So if you're missing this document, there's several ways you can get it. Today's goal really is to share, for those of you who don't know a lot about the charter and the process, what that's all about, but importantly to know that based on last year's conference, there was a large implementation group put together, and that work has advanced significantly. So this session is going to be led by Dr. Stephanie Michaud, who is the president and CEO of BioCanRx, who is also one of the conference's co-chairs. I am also going to reintroduce you to Stephen Sundquist, who will be speaking on the panel, and Judy Needham, who I will introduce now. Judy Needham is currently chair of the Patient Representatives Committee, Canadian Cancer Trials Group, and a 17-year breast cancer survivor. Professionally, she retired from a corporate marketing career to volunteer with the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation, which led to her work at Ctti. At Ctti, she was instrumental in leading the redesign of the patient representation role. Judy was also the first Canadian recipient of the Canadian Cancer Research Alliance's Award for Exceptional Leadership in Patient Involvement in Cancer Research in 2017. I personally have had the good fortune of working with Judy, and I can say that she deserves that award and more. She provides exceptional and extraordinary patient voice to this conference and the work that CCC does. We have had 2 unfortunate personal issues happen, one with Vatche Bartekian as well as Martine Elias. Both of them, for personal reasons, had to, at very last minute, step down from today's presentation. So Barry Stein is, I can think of no one better to step in for both. He's going to be doing double duty. So I will now pass it over to Stephen and Judy for the presentation portion.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, Judy.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here talking to this group today. And also on behalf of myself and Stephen, my colleague, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we're going to talk about today. So a little bit of background. I'm going to start this session by talking about why patient engagement in research, and what exactly does patient-centered mean, and what does it mean to a clinical trial? And, how can patients contribute to this incredible work that's currently underway that we've heard about today? We want to touch on that. And in doing that, I'm going to provide an example of what patient engagement can look like from ideation to closure. And then I'm going to turn it over to Stephen, who's going to do a little bit of a recap of the charter and what the model is. And the patient engagement charter has evolved out of this conference and the work that's come out of this conference sponsored by CCC over the last couple of years. And then we'll move into the round table discussion. So without any further ado, I want to move into this portion of the presentation. So what is patient engagement in research? I like to start off all of my presentations by just grounding us for the purpose of this discussion, that patient engagement in research is twofold. Number one, patients as participants. Those are the human participants in the clinical trial. But secondly, patients as partners in determining, developing, and delivering the research question to ensure, number one, patient feasibility, and secondly, outcomes that matter to patients. So this presentation focuses on the latter, as it focuses on patients as partners. So I think there's a lot of terminology out there that's patient-centered, patient terminology, patient-centered research, patient-centered endpoints, pros, patient-centered outcomes. And I think it's important to understand them and how they are related. So I want to demonstrate that to you in this diagram, this cycle of patient-centered care and patient-centered research. So starting at the top with patient-centered care. The definition of patient-centered care is the patient is at the center of the decision-making process, including the selection of the treatment or the intervention that we're to receive, and whether or not the treatment is a success, so the outcome. So very unlike maybe a generation or two ago, my grandmother's generation or my mother's generation, I very much want to be a part of the decision-making. I want to be informed and be making decisions about my health treatment with my team, my medical team. So seeking outcomes that matter to a patient is an important consideration when developing a research question. Therefore, the patient perspective in defining that research protocol is critical, which leads to patient-centered research. So Farley Library Research Guide defines patient-centered research as two parts. Number one, of course, the very important scientific question, that disease-oriented evidence that is being sought, and that's usually the primary endpoint of a clinical trial. But secondly, patient-oriented evidence that measures things that a patient would care about, such as improvement of symptoms, quality of life, cost of intervention, morbidity, mortality, etc. Essentially, whether or not the intervention helps patients live longer or better lives. So including patient-oriented endpoints evidence in studies is important, but it's often missed. So therefore, involving the patient perspective to assist with inclusion of these patient-oriented endpoints in the research question is critical, which leads to patient engagement in research, which we've already talked about a little in terms of that can be two-part, the human participant in the trial or the partner in research in developing and delivering that research question. So the patient perspective is integrated into the definition and inclusion of patient-centered study questions for augmenting the scientific question that can lead to patient-oriented outcomes in addition to disease-oriented. So this in turn feeds back to and completes the cycle of enabling patient-centered care. So all of the patient-centered terminology that we hear is truly linked into a cycle of delivering that patient-centered care. So I want to provide a little bit of a case example, a patient-centered approach to academic clinical trials, and I'm going to use the Canadian Cancer Trials Group Patient Engagement Framework to give you that example. Just a little bit of background if you're not familiar with the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. It is a cooperative, academic, multi-centered clinical trials group. It's partners with 85 cancer centers across Canada. More than 2,100 researchers are a part of the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. There is patient representatives from across Canada, and this is supported by a central office at Queen's University in Kingston. Oh, there we go. So in a larger research pathway, clinical trials is just a small piece of that. And later on, Stephen is going to be speaking to you about this larger research pathway, but I'm just going to be focusing on the clinical trial portion of that, phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. So in the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, I've spoken about the membership across Canada. So the structure is a committee structure. So the researchers from across Canada are organized into committees representing each of the major cancer disease sites. And you can see those listed on the left. Those disease site committees comprise the scientific committees. We have an investigational new drugs program, which is another one, and an endpoints committee. We have oversight committees that look at and approve clinical trials. We have data safety monitoring, oversight committees, and strategic executive advisory council. And then on the very right, you see support committees. My purpose of showing you this slide is to try to demonstrate to you at an overall organizational structure how patient engagement has been embedded into the committee structure of the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. So you can see by my little people icons, each one of the disease site committees has patient representatives who work with the scientific members of those committees in developing a trial from ideation right through to closure. But over on the right, under those support committees, you'll also see the patient representative committees. So collectively, we as patients form our own committee as well, and we have our own strategic objectives that align with the overall Canadian Cancer Trials Group strategy, in addition to supporting the development of the clinical trials, etc. So I've shown you a picture of the organizational structure, but I want to now show you a picture of our product. Our product at the Canadian Cancer Trials Group is the clinical trial. And the life cycle of that clinical trial I have demonstrated here with the chevrons in the middle of this slide. Right through from the time that a clinical trial is an idea in a researcher's head, right through to the time that the trial closes and changes practice. Above the chevrons, I've shown the researcher's role in each one of these steps. And below the chevrons, I've shown the patient's role in each one of these steps. So if you are looking at how do you engage patients in your organization or in the work that you're doing, I think there's two important questions that you need to ask. Number one, what is our organization structure and where does it make sense to have patient touch points? Secondly, what is the product that we produce? And in the Canadian Cancer Trials Group case, that product is the clinical trial. So what is my product or service? And where does it make sense in the life cycle of developing that product to have patient engagement, to where is it important for patient hands to touch and provide value add to that product? So I'm going to quickly go through right from the time that a trial is just an idea. It's important, and the scientific community on the committee will solicit patient priorities and embed those into the ideation phase. When that idea is being written on paper and a new proposal is being developed, the patient is approached in a very formal fashion. We've developed tools and a mechanism for patients to provide the input for inclusion of those patient-centered endpoints that I talked about earlier, and also to review the trial, even at this early ideation, idea first being put on paper stage for patient feasibility. When the next chevron, review and prioritize and fund. So we have patient representatives who sit on our clinical trials committee that reviews and scores and prioritizes and funds. We also provide input into CIHR grants, etc. When the protocol and consent is being developed, we have, again, another touch point where the patient representative will review on a very formal basis for patient feasibility and easeability again. When the trial is launched and it's going out to centers across Canada, there are recruitment strategies, patient-facing materials that are being developed that our patient representatives play a huge part in. While a trial is accruing and data collection is happening out there in those centers across Canada, our patient reps are monitoring that trial for accrual issues and providing, identifying patient barriers and providing that feedback. Also, at the same time, we have patient representatives who populate the Data Safety Monitoring Committee and look for any patient safety issues on a regular basis. When a trial is endpoints are met and the trial is closing, the patient is engaged in, again, publication of patient-facing materials in addition to the material that would be being published in medical journals. So we are a dedicated patient group, so to speak. We have reps that we bring on for a 3-year term and renewable one time. So but I'd like to overlay now where I think there are opportunities for patient groups to get engaged in this portion of the research life cycle. So going back to the beginning, certainly we've identified gaps. It's interesting. We are in our strategic planning sessions now for the next 5-year granting cycle, and the committees are busy at work identifying what their research priorities are going to be for the next 5 years. And we know that 1 or 2 patient reps on a committee cannot provide all of the input that's required. So there's a huge opportunity here for patient groups to be involved in those priority setting exercises. Also, there's opportunities in once projects are approved, there's funding and opportunities to be involved in that review and prioritizing and funding. There's opportunities when a trial is being activated across Canada to be providing patient-facing materials and awareness about that particular trial, and so on and so forth. I guess the one part that I think there's a real opportunity beyond the trial closure in a clinical trial, and the last chevron, change in practice. I think there's opportunities there for engagement, for knowledge transfer, etc., working with drug approval processes, etc., that aren't part of the current process that we have now. When we developed this patient engagement model in the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, we very much looked to see what was happening elsewhere in the world. And I put up the UK because although all of the NCI, NCTN groups in the United States, including Alliance, SWOG, etc., our models are very, very similar. We have a very similar patient engagement model also to the UK. So I wanted to show you that. So in summary, patient engagement in research, and I really like the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research definition here. So using the Michael Smith Foundation to inform us in Canada, patient-oriented research refers to research that engages patients as partners, again, not as participants, but as partners, focuses on patient-identified priorities, and improves patient outcomes. And I think key, and I want to use this to lead into Stephen's portion of this presentation. This research conducted by multidisciplinary teams in partnership with stakeholders, which we have around the table at this conference today, aims to apply the knowledge generated to improve healthcare systems and practices. So I think the most important part is not just engaging patients, but there are many stakeholders that are a part of this, a part of research and critical to successful research. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you, Stephen, to start talking about the patient engagement stakeholders charter.
Great. Thank you, Judy. I'd like to echo your last point, first of all, with respect to the breadth of stakeholder engagement. Not only does the content that I'm about to talk about provide a framework for engagement for patient groups, but the process of development and implementation of the charter and the Canadian ICD model for patient engagement in itself is an excellent example of multi-stakeholder involvement. In fact, everyone on the panel here and Stephanie as the moderator, as well as Vatche and Martine had a hand in co-developing what will be presented. So I wanted to acknowledge that as an excellent example, first of all. To recap and building on the timeline that Judy's introduced and Anne-Marie provided in the introduction, Colorectal Cancer Canada has really taken a lead role in development of the patient group engagement pathway model and the charter. But this is a proposed use for all stakeholders in Canada, whether all sponsors, patient groups, patients alike, in fact, stakeholders in the clinical research continuum. This timeline showcases where we are now in the development of the charter, and I'm pleased to be the person in this conference to present the outcome and the tenets of the charter document that have been finalized at this point. It's a long way, a lot of work and a long time in development. So we're hoping that you see the benefits to that. The aim is to establish those foundations for collaborative engagement in clinical trials between trial sponsors, patient groups, and define a common set of roles and language for all stakeholders involved in developing patient engagement frameworks and processes, so that hopefully it's made more clear and those opportunities for engagement are highlighted, and there's some thought behind that. So to give a bit of a history, to start off, for many of you involved in the development of the Canadian ICD patient group pathway model, this will be familiar to you. But its aim was to develop a Canadian framework, a uniquely Canadian framework for integrating the patient voice into cancer clinical trials and the trial continuum and trial development processes. CCC led this initiative As you know, this was supported by their own scientific advisory committee, made up of experts, advisors, oncologists, network members, clinical trial network members, researchers, and patients alike. That was kicked off in June of 2017 with the stakeholder consensus meeting. That was of the 65 attendees. There was a uniform and unanimous agreement that the city model could be adopted for Canada. And that's in fact what followed. That finalized city model that was presented previously at this conference outlines a set of recommendations in place for each stakeholder group, as well as a suite of tools available to help initiate that engagement and involvement of patient groups. That original model in the US was implemented in 2007 and has been published widely. And there is already a well-established demonstration of the positive financial benefits to research sponsors, in addition to the intuitive benefits for engaging patient groups in research. The Canadianized model seeks to reflect our own research and public payer environment, as well as the unique role of patient groups in this country. The expert working group has led the development of that framework and their launch in December of 2017. Showing here the figure representation of the pathway model, the Canadianized pathway model. 3CTN, of which I am involved, plays a role, much like Judy described with CCTG, in the clinical trial space. But the intent of the model demonstrates real examples for how patient groups can be involved throughout the trial life cycle, the clinical trial continuum, as well as the CTA approval process, as well as post-approval studies and outcomes, RWE to RWD data strategies, and much of that have occupied much of the discussion today as well. So this model, again, we won't go over in detail, just seeks to provide real examples and context for how patient groups can get involved in research. So at this point, I'm pleased to introduce the charter itself. Everyone involved in this and participating in this meeting today will have access to the charter document in full, but what we wanted to do today was present the 5 charter tenets for stakeholder commitment that form that foundational approach for organizations, really the how for organizations to consider and integrating and collaborating with patient groups as partners, as well as for patient groups themselves in seeking opportunities and unique fits within their capabilities and strategies for partnering with sponsors and academic and industry alike in research development. So outlining the 5 charter tenets, they are firstly to make patient centricity a norm in clinical trials. Number 2 is to support effective patient group participation in clinical trial design and implementation through education, training, and development. That support of those patient groups in enabling them to play the most effective role in co-development. Collaborating with patient groups as equal and independent partners to optimize the success of clinical trials. Adhering to transparency and accountability throughout the clinical trial continuum amongst stakeholders. And finally, maximizing the potential to collect and utilize RWE and RWD captured in clinical trials. So as we move forward, we're going to and explore each of the tenants. We'll try to address and help clarify what the underlying intent of each of the tenants, but also what the foundational aspects of the how can this be brought about. And with each introduction of each tenant, I believe Stephanie will moderate a discussion. Any questions that participants may have relating to the tenant and or any recommendations or feedback that you can give rather. So tenant 1 envisions ensuring studies are designed to realize the outcomes that are relevant to patients and includes their preferences as well as trade-offs to achieve in the achievement of clinically meaningful results and an enhancement of patient quality of life and health outcomes while minimizing the burden of disease and the treatment intervention. It increases access to trials by reducing barriers and ensuring that eligibility criteria are fair and appropriate. Another example of this tenet would be simplifying the informed consent document to provide transparent, comprehensible CT information in a language that's relevant to patients. Another opportunity is to engage patients in two-way communication and dialogue throughout the trial continuum and the process. Solicit, elicit, and incorporate their feedback, as well as provide access to mechanisms like digital and mobile health technologies where possible that can support participation and ease of participation. Connect patients to internal and external support programs and other resources through convenient and user-friendly channels, and provide patients with uninterrupted access to effective clinical trial therapies. I'm going to pause there for input.
Stephen, would you like folks to ask questions or provide comments through chat, or both?
Sure. Either or.
Yeah. Can I make a suggestion that we continue to the next one? And I would really encourage the audience to, as they have any further comments on Tenant 1, to provide them through chat and or the question function. Thank you.
I can proceed through the tenants, and if there's any questions that come up, please do let me know. Okay, tenant 2, what this endeavors to put forward and is a foundational element of tenant 2. Some of those elements are commitments to engage with patients and patient groups early on, as well as on an ongoing basis to work together effectively throughout the continuum of clinical trials and the trial's clinical development process, support training of patient groups and evaluation initiatives while working together with them collaboratively and encouraging their input and active participation in development, implementation, or reporting of trials, really supporting the patient group's understanding and maximizing the potential for their involvement and benefit from their involvement. Next up, supporting patient groups' ability to record patient values and preferences during and post-clinical trials, so really enabling patient groups to support that activity. Supporting training of other research stakeholders, including sponsor reps, to ensure best practices are met in their engagement with patient groups, really supporting the sponsors through this sometimes new environment for engaging with patient groups and navigating that process, those new processes. And finally, supporting the evaluation and sharing of impact of engagement with patient groups, really broadcasting and communicating the benefits to others that are perhaps pre-contemplative or contemplating and not of the benefits of patient group engagement, really sharing those lessons learned and the value. Okay, I'll proceed to Tenant 3. The commitments in Tenant align with Tenant 3 for striving to change the culture of trials to ensure that patient groups are recognized as equal independent partners and to optimize in order to optimize success of the trial, is supported by commitments to build strong partnerships with patient groups and all stakeholders by agreeing on joint expectations, responsibilities, and the commitment to promote cooperation, including patient insight in the development of the consent process and patient-facing materials. This is largely adopted as a practice in many trials, but certainly isn't common, isn't yet a common practice. Facilitating the connection between trial participants and patient groups for a disease type. Promoting awareness and education of trials among patient groups while integrating their involvement in the design and implementation of the trial. Working with patient groups to integrate patient needs from conception of trials to expedite and facilitate access to trial information, patient-facing materials, and the trial consent. Acting with integrity and respect for the independence of patient groups in this process. Moving to Tenet 4, adhering to the transparency and accountability throughout the continuum of the clinical trial continuum. Commitments there embedded within the charter are to bolster trust through open dialogue and interaction with patient groups and seek their input throughout the continuum and the trial life cycle as needed. Working collaborative with patient groups to better understand and address patients' unmet needs, preferences, and trade-offs, really helping to inform the values and preferences that are captured or ensure those values and perspectives are captured within the trial itself, as well as understanding the current disease burden that's borne by patients. I think patient groups are uniquely capable of supporting that and informing on that. Next up, sharing information with patient groups and patients in a neutral, uninfluencing, and objective manner, where data is presented clearly and accurately, as well as in a balanced and fair context to allow patient groups to form their own independent opinion and interpretation of the data. Commitments among stakeholders to hold themselves to the highest levels of accountability by ensuring that independence of all stakeholders involved is maintained and respected, and by implementing clear conflict of interest and disclosure guidelines to help assure that. Develop trust and confidence in the methods and methodologies used throughout, and incorporate and preserve transparency in sharing the aggregate results of trials with patients and patient groups, regardless of the trial outcome, in a timely, efficient, and comprehensible manner. Okay, moving to the last tenet number 5, looks again at intending to maximize the potential to collect and utilize RWE, RWD captured in all trials. As a result, or in an effort to support that, there's a commitment within the charter to consider real-world evidence and data in the collection, its collection, in order to render the results more generalizable, to achieve greater external validity of the results, and to better support access, appropriateness of use, and affordability of the interventions being tested. Next up is communicating in lay language for good comprehension, of course, by patient groups, the research goals, methods, procedures, data being collected, as well as the findings resulting from the use and analysis of the data. Ensuring that the data is complete, reliable, and processed in a consistent manner, that best practices in data collection and analysis are applied from initiation of the study design and maintained throughout all trials in the continuum. And finally, sharing RWE, RWD data post-trial in a timely manner, again, to ensure that there's greatest impact and potential impact for patients and caregivers to help with their own decision making. So as individual stakeholders in attendance here, the questions that we as a working group would put to you would be to consider, and perhaps comment here too, how the charter affects or can inform your own organization's patient engagement model, and determine how to implement patient engagement within your operation. Questioning how does the charter perhaps inform that process or incite reconsideration of how you may implement your patient engagement model. So at this point in the development and the timeline, coming back to the Chevron model representation of the timeline, in developing the charter, there's been a mapping of general processes for stakeholder adoption and the operationalization rather of the charter and the city pathway model that's been accomplished. Ahead, we're looking to support independent patient group training programs as a working group as part of the implementation strategy. Those support mechanisms as well for patient groups and stakeholders so that it will enable broader scalability of the adoption of the charter across the Canadian stakeholder group. Oh.
Yeah. Stephen, there was 2 comments on the tenants. Would it be helpful to you if I fed those to you? One is a comment and one is a question.
Sure, we can pause here.
Okay. The first one, it's actually a comment, not a question. It came from Jen Gordon. And I'm not sure of the acronym, but it's CBCN. It's just to reinforce that tenant number 2 is very, very critical to increase the capacity of patient groups to facilitate the delivery of the balance of the tenants. So just to highlight that that was a critically important tenant, number 1. And number 2, there's a question here from Catherine Hayes who asks, how will you ensure that patient groups are always representative in all of this? And that really is an implementation question, but I thought it'd be a great way to set up the conversation for the panel as well.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point and something that has come up in the working group's discussions. I think, well, certainly for myself, I would suggest that's the capacity to have that for patient groups to ensure that there's a representativeness is certainly one of the challenges that we've identified. So I would agree with that comment. In terms of how, I'm not sure I can comment on that. I'm not sure. Barry, maybe from your perspective, would you be able to respond?
I would be happy to respond. I'm not sure if I'm live now. Can you hear me?
Yes, Barry, you're good.
Okay, great. So I think that certainly is a challenge to ensure that you are representative, and that's why we try to include as many patients as we can in this process. But like in a clinical trial, you can never be too sure because you're sort of those type of people who are interested in providing input tend to be the same type of people or the same people very often who contribute to the process. But generally speaking, what we try to do is incorporate that we have a broad mix of patients who can provide that type of input. Underscoring what Jen, by the way, CBCN is the Canadian Breast Cancer Network. So welcome, Jen. I think these are really important. And when we start talking about where our next steps in terms of adoption and implementation of the charter itself, I think you're going to start to better understand the representativity that's required and that can occur. And I think that, though that's one of the reasons which we're going to make a call for, I'm sure Stephen was coming to that, to welcome other groups, not only for the adoption, but to consider implementation steps for this charter. I don't want to get too carried away, and because I know Stephen has a little bit more to say, I should say, and I do want to give the perspective also of what Martine would have said, more or less, and Vatche, who is a CRO, Vantage BioTrials, so we'll try to get that perspective in as well. But just in answer to that question, I think it is a challenge. Most of the groups in Canada are representative of the patient population, to the best that I can see. And generally, they are the ones who are providing the input into the health technology assessment process as well. But I don't think you can be 100% sure in every single case. And that's why the patient group is perhaps the route to go, more so than the individual patient, or both in combination, because the patient group tends to have an institutional memory of many patients put together over an extended period of time, whereas an individual patient will give the input for the moment and may not be as representative. So I hope that answers.
Barry, I was going to echo that last point from the perspective that I have at 3CTN. We have patient representation within our organization, as well as at the Cancer Clinical Trial member cancer centers involved in trial conduct and informing trial activities. One of the challenges that we've come up against in the past is that very issue, and have turned to patient groups, and our patient partners have involved patient groups in seeking specific experiences with a specific trial and intervention on disease type. So I can echo that last point, that I think patient groups themselves provide that added benefit.
And I'd like to build on the comments that have been made so far by Barry and Stephen. I think there are opportunities on both the part of these sponsors and the stakeholders to ensure that patient groups are representative. I think patient groups have the opportunity to reach out to sponsors, whether it's pharma, academia, or CROs. And at the same time, sponsors have the opportunity to reach out to the patient group. So I think it's two-sided. And I know certainly there's instances where I can think of where we've reached out to patient groups, we being the Canadian Cancer Trials Group, and they've reached out to us. So I think it's twofold.
I think if I can pick up and continue with the last slide here we have in the deck, and that's really tied to what Barry was saying earlier. And what we wanted to do to wrap things up was highlight the next steps for the charter, and that is to support the implementation and broader adoption, and really consider too what the long-term strategy is for maintaining the charter and supporting new stakeholders in their adoption. So the goals for moving forward are to again broadcast and disseminate and call upon members here and participants here, as well as CCC will continue to roll out the charter to potential stakeholders through a strategy that's being developed, as well supporting the adoption by those stakeholders. And then next up, assuring that there's the support structure, the infrastructure and resource supports available to enable a sustainable integration into collective practice. We want to make sure that the work that has gone into developing the charter and the model have long-term benefit and utility for stakeholders. So at this point, that call for the collective participants here to support the stakeholder working group at this stage, I'd like to echo that request. I think we will speak, and Anne-Marie and Barry can speak to just how you can get involved or put your name forward or your organization forward to get involved. We would welcome that. We do want to ask for representatives to help us with the task of identifying and addressing key opportunities, as well as what we anticipate, I think has come up in the questions and the discussion. Some of one example, at least, of the barriers or potential barriers to charter adoption and implementation. Secure resources that we recognize will be needed, those being financial, time, materials, as well as a platform for hosting the charter and the model, and commit necessary development to the framework and that infrastructure needed. Set up long-term stewardship and governance, and advocate for charter integration into clinical trial guidelines and standard operating procedures, as well as work practices. And there is a link there for those that might be interested to submit their interest. I wanted to take the opportunity to, on behalf of Judy and I, to thank you for your time, and we'll turn this over to Stephanie.
Great. Sounds good. Can you folks hear me?
Ken.
Perfect. I hope there's not too much of a delay. So I really want to thank both Judy and Stephen for an absolutely outstanding session. I think that we had a fantastic introduction to what patient engagement looks like, from ideation to execution of a clinical trial, with a presentation that was provided to us by Judy, and all of the work that she's done at Ctti. There is the voice of experience, if there ever is one. So that was fantastic. And Stephen, what a behemoth task you had before you to summarize the many years of work that have been undertaken in developing and getting to this point. So you did an outstanding job there, really highlighting all of the work that's been done, the rationale, positioning where we are, and really to the community. I think this is a pivotal time for the implementation of this charter, and we need you to be able to participate and to continue this phenomenal piece of work that's been really spearheaded by CCC. And to Barry and the team, thank you for spearheading this initiative. It's really important for it to have happened and for it to continue, because the success of this initiative will mean better improvements in clinical trial design, but also at the end of the line of a clinical trial execution, once market authorization is obtained, better drugs for cancer patients. So thank you very, very much for that. I do not have I'm not sure if at this point, if there are any further questions from the folks that are attending. Anne-Marie, I'm looking to you because I don't have access to the box. Yes?
Not a problem, Stephanie. We've answered the questions that have been asked so far, and as they come up, I will happily feed them to you. Perfect. So, and of course, from the audience, please do contribute with this as you have a question. But we'll leave it with you, Stephanie, to lead the panel.
Great. So as Barry has noted, my two colleagues, Vatche and Martine, could not be with us, and both of them bring a very unique perspective with respect to the implementation of the charter. I myself have been involved pretty much since the beginning with respect to the work that's being discussed, in particular in this panel session. I know that Barry's going to speak to the perspective of the CRO and the unique role that they can play with respect to implementation of the charter. Martine, of course, underscoring the importance of the charter and what it means for cancer patients moving forward. So I thought I would kick us off, and this is a question for the participants, for the presenters, of course, and Barry, my fellow discussant. And my first question is as follows to all of you. Can you comment, and you've alluded to this, of course, on what positive results we would expect? So what does success look like from the inclusion of empowered patient groups as representatives of patients in all phases of the cancer clinical trial process?
So who is going to respond to that first? Well, let me just, since Martine and Vatche are not here, I'll just take their role and just get the ball started, get it rolling, I should say. So first of all, just to take a step back, because I do know that there are some new participants to the meeting today who may not be fully aware of the charter and the why for the charter and the what and the how, so to speak. So I really encourage you. You can download it from the site. It went out with the materials at registration because it does give the background as well as to why the charter is so important. I think from the perspective of whether you're a patient group, whether you're a CRO, whether you're a sponsor of a trial, namely either a pharmaceutical company or an academic, the benefits may vary and may be different. But at the end of the day, I think the point is to have, first of all, increased patient-centric trials, as Judy put, from the ideation all the way through the clinical trial continuum. And secondly, so that we don't have a trial, for example, that the patient can't comply with, can't come in to, can't participate in properly, and also so that the results are clinically meaningful for that patient and that patient population. And the second point that I would like to sort of raise is that when we talk about, and we've done a lot of talking today about some of the new precision medicines and real-world evidence, it's essential that the patient group and the patients follow not only from the ideation, the creation, and design of the trial, but participate with the patient in terms of providing support during the trial and be able to follow up with the patients post-trial so that we can gather that type of relevant information, not just on patient-reported outcomes, but also on the patient preferences and values. So there's a huge benefit also for health technology assessment people who are doing the evaluation on the expert committees, but also at the end result for patients and their families so that we can really identify those drugs which are meaningful to patients in accordance with their values and preferences. So what I mean to say is whether you are the sponsor of a trial as a pharmaceutical company or an academic, whether you're actually conducting the trials as a CRO and actually having to deal with patients and you're sponsors of the trial at the same time, you want to have a meaningful trial. And the results have to be such that not only are they important for the patients and their families and their caregivers, but that it can be meaningful enough such that the regulators, when they approve a drug, understand the effectiveness of the drug clearly, and that those who are doing the health technology assessments understand not just the cost effectiveness of it, but really what the clinical benefit, but also what the patient preferences and values are all the way through the process. So with that being said, when we talk about precision medicines and the fact that in many cases we may only have phase 2 data and we need to follow through with the patients throughout the continuum to collect that additional data, we have to make sure that those trials are designed with realistic endpoints that may go well beyond the time of filing for an NOC, and that if there is a NOCC, a conditional notice of compliance, that we are there as patient groups to help to provide that information to ultimately release that condition if that is such as a case, or if the condition, of course, isn't met, that the drug is, as our panel on value-based agreements was talking about, is removed from the marketplace. So really, there's a what's in it for me from almost everybody, slightly different from every stakeholder along the clinical trial continuum.
Great.
I can add to that.
Stephen.
Just
Please
adding
go
to
ahead.
Barry's, and when we drill down on the clinical trials piece and that stage, both Judy and I can speak to that from the academic sponsor perspective on Judy's part. But with regards to taking a more specific focus in trials and the conduct of the trials, again, the cancer trial unit, the clinical trial units at the cancer centers that are part of 3CTN look to and have an opportunity with this as the charter, to use the charter as a guide for engaging with patient groups themselves, not as a sponsor, but as a trial unit, and collectively over the long term, have this serve as a guide for how they can engage patients, because the current challenges, or the challenges that they face, are finding representative patients with expertise or experience with a specific disease or trial, even a participation in a trial design. So patient groups, again, enable that to take place, and for them to be able to consult with patient partners and get access to patient partners much more readily. So there's opportunities there that we see as a network, and we're excited about.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. The same is the case for us at BioCanRx. Absolutely. Judy, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yes, I would like to. Thank you, Stephanie. So just stepping back to when the charter was first envisioned, and the issues that were identified were awareness, and Barry, you talked today about the low rates of accrual, and it was great to hear one of our presenters today talk about that 4 to 6% moving up to 8%. That's great, but you know, I think success is meaningful engagement versus tokenism, and so I would say don't stop at having someone engaged or patient engagement and say, okay, I've got someone on my committee, I've got a bum in a seat now, so it's done. Meaningful engagement needs to be addressing and can address, you know, patient feasibility. I talked about that a little bit in my presentation. How feasible is this trial from a patient perspective? I can walk through it in a patient's shoes and see if there's barriers here for me. But also the patient-centered endpoints will, you know, better patient feasibility and better patient-centered endpoints equal better accrual. So it addresses what we were first setting out to accomplish. So the patient groups can provide incredible input to those patient-centered endpoints. What, in addition to that scientific question that's being asked, what are the benefits to me? And having those patient-centered endpoints takes away that guinea pig perception that patients have of a clinical trial. If only the scientific question is being asked and they see that they will make a contribution to future science, it's okay. But if there's a benefit there, if there's patient-centered endpoints there that exist for them, there's the better takings of accrual. So I think success is addressing our original awareness and accrual objectives, increasing those, and the patient groups have a huge opportunity to do that.
Absolutely.
I think too, as it's been mentioned, it speaks to the validity of the process, and to be able to have meaningful engagement and have patient groups play a part in that. Without it, I think as we move forward, it becomes a liability for research.
I think the charter is a roadmap for meaningful engagement versus just engagement.
Well said.
I think more often you're seeing now, particularly pharmaceutical companies who are making a concerted effort in terms of patient centricity. And as Judy said, we as patient groups certainly just don't want them to check the box, have somebody, a patient present, and therefore, that's good enough. This is really an involved commitment, which, as we noted in the charter, requires training so that it can be meaningful. And within the scope of the type of declaration, for example, that inspired some of our work from Novartis's patient declaration and other companies that have similar types of declarations where they say they have a commitment to engage with the patient. Well, this helps to govern that relationship. This provides a framework from the very outset in 5 easy tenets. Someone should make a movie called that. Something like that, 5 easy pieces on how to actually carry out a clinical trial, taking the type of CCTG framework, but actually looking at those commitments. Now, to this extent, this is something that follows with the model that Stephen showed you, where we Canadianize the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative model. Which the FDA adopted and is looked to as a gold standard in terms of clinical trials. And it's our intention. This is not a colorectal cancer Canada project. It is something that we initiated. It is something that we want to see everybody take ownership of. So that we will be looking for a home so that all people engaged in clinical trials actually internationally can look to this charter, and we call it a dynamic charter because it may have to be adapted depending on the type of trial that's going on, and look to it as a framework, as I said, to work with patient groups and not just the patient. The patient is obviously included in the full picture, in the continuum, but also as a resource, as we mentioned, for recruitment, for retention, for design, ideation of the trial, but most importantly, even post-trial, and what kind of relationship that can exist between the patient group and for those drugs where we have only a conditional type of acceptance to it. It will become of paramount importance as we move forward with precision medicines.
Stephanie, may I add
Yes.
a comment that just came through the question box? And again, it's not a question, it's a comment, but I thought it was so capturing of the last 10 minutes of conversation. Again, it was shared with Catherine Hayes. Patient engagement can also be simply tokenism. Please be real with us. I think it's a good copy line. Nice way to summarize that conversation.
But we
Absolutely.
don't want to that's the point of the charter, But that requires that there is adoption by the various stakeholders out there, and that is the job over the course of the next coming year, which we hope to report on next year, of the working group, who are an amazing group of people, all of which are not all of the people on the panel here, but everybody here today is part of that. And it's a wonderful accomplishment, which has been recognized because we do have people on the panel from all of the stakeholder groups, including industry. And we really do believe that this is something that can be adopted over the course of the next year. And that's what the job is over the next year, the adoption and implementation of this charter.
Thanks, Barry.
Sure.
Anne Marie, any questions or
There is no further
from
questions.
folks? Perfect.
No, there is no further questions. So, Stefan, if you want to wrap up the panel, then we're going to go to a quick commercial, and then we're going to wrap up the conference.
Sounds good. So thank you, everybody, for your insights, for highlighting yet again your preaching, of course, to the converted. As Barry mentioned, I have been on this working group, and this is something that myself and my organization strongly believe in. But a sincere thanks for all of you. I know how much work has gone into making this a reality, and I thank you for this outstanding discussion today. I think implementation is right around the corner.
Thank you,
Thank
Thank
panel.
you all.
Quick commercial. Come on back for closing comments. We won't be long.
Nous sommes d'horizons différents. Nous nous distinguons par notre apparence, notre mode de vie, la façon que nous avons d'aimer.
Seriously, bacon? We're coming. All right, got to go.
Et de prier. Mais nous avons aussi beaucoup en commun. Un même engagement, une aspiration partagée, celle d'offrir le meilleur de nous-mêmes sur le plan des idées, à la recherche de remèdes qui permettront de sauver des vies, en misant sur une compréhension commune du pouvoir de la science. Chez Pfizer, nous sommes ces gens audacieux et différents qui aspirent tous au même but, à trouver le remède.
So what a wonderful conclusion to a really exciting day. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you who participated in this conference today, whether by asking questions or even just by sticking with us throughout the course of the day and listening to all this wonderful, all the wonderful presenters. So thank you, of course, once again to all of our sponsors without which this would never have been possible, and to our presenters who provided some of the most current and rich information available in their field, advancing the question of cancer clinical trials in the era of precision medicine, real-world evidence and value frameworks, and how we can overcome the barriers to accessing new precision medicines. How can you, as a participant and to this conference, play a role in the future of precision medicines in Canada in your capacity by improving cancer clinical trials and patient outcomes, whether you're a patient group, researcher, from industry, government agency, work in AI, for example, or you're a health economist. If you're interested to work with us in order to promote the Charter and our work in this area, I'd ask you to contact us. You had some other emails before, and you can even use my email, barrys@colorectalcancercanada.com, or call us, write us in any way that you can. We'd love to have you on board. We're now going into the phase, which we'll report on next year, of implementation, adoption of it and implementation of the Charter. And we hope to see you during the year. If you join the wonderful working group that we have, and it really is a wonderful working group, and see you next year with a new report that Natalie, who's been in the background taking notes, will be working on, and hopefully we'll be publishing on the Charter very shortly. So thank you all once again for your participation, for being with us the entire day. It was a fantastic day of information, and it is recorded, so you will have the opportunity to see it on our website and on this website as well, and enjoy it. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on it, either by tweeting. We're at @ColonCanada, and or by letters or writing, or even just calling us to let us know. Thanks once again.
Good.
Anne-Marie?
Thanks very, very much. And Barry and I didn't rehearse our closure, so let me put up a couple of slides. The most important one, and I know that the team at CCC is so looking forward to your input on the survey. So you may recall at the very front end of this session, there is a link right underneath the sponsor slide where it says, click here to complete the survey. Please do so now. You've got a couple of moments to fill it out. The questionnaire is fairly extensive, but it's done for a very specific reason. So please do that. If for some reason you have to run, I know that CCC is intending to send a note out to all of the registrants for this conference as well to get your feedback. There's also an opportunity here to volunteer, to submit your name for a volunteer, just to reinforce what Barry has said as well. So I am not going to summarize the conference except with one comment. We have spent the last 8 hours talking about an extensive amount of insightful, futuristic information. The key theme that consistently comes up at this conference, and we've seen it build over the last 4 years, is the role of patients, the role of patient groups, and the absolute embracement of their role across not just the clinical trial process, but across the spectrum of care. We're seeing a real tsunami of this kind of pathway across the industry in many, many ways. So if that was the recurring theme, it was that patients are gaining in importance and patient groups more and more. Thank you again for your attendance. A reminder, I'm just going to put up a quick slide here on how to get how to access the webinar. Within 24 to 48 hours, you are given a link to join this conference. That same link will be live for you to see the webinar from today. It will also be posted on the colorectal cancer microsite, which is all you have to do is go to Colorectal Cancer Canada. You'll see the link to the microsite there, and you'll be able to find it. And of course, you still got Sarita and Carol. Here is their telephone numbers. Give you a chance to write those down as you're madly filling out that survey as well. Thank you again for your attendance. We don't have to wish everyone safe travels home because I think everybody's at home.